Today we're going to talk about sex and gender, how we learn gender and how it's performed in our behaviors and language. We're going to talk specifically about gender and language, and then in part 2 of this lesson we're going to go into gender stratification across countries, and specifically we're going to look at 2 different studies, the Gender Inequality Index and also the World Economic Forum study. So the first thing that I want to discuss is the gender variance. So what does this mean? Basically, when we're looking at cultures, there's a spectrum of gender equality. So if we're looking at one side of the spectrum, we see gender egalitarianism or equality. So this is going to be a culture where we see overlap of gender norms and behaviors. And then on the right-hand side, we see gender stratification or inequality. So this is where we're going to see greater gaps in gender equality. So this is always changing, always moving. If we were to look at the United States, would you say that we're more of an equal society when it comes to gender or unequal? Many of you would probably say equal. But when we start looking at the studies, we see that there are still a lot of gender gaps in the United States. So we'd be probably to the middle, maybe a little bit closer to gender stratification or inequality. All right, so specifically, when you're growing up, what were some of your favorite toys or childhood pastimes? What did you like to do for fun? Me personally, I like to play dress up with my friends. We used to just dress up in my mom's old clothes, put on makeup. We would play house dolls. My brother, on the other hand, played games like war, and he played with Nerf guns and airsoft pellets. And so where do we come to learn some of our gender behaviors? We learn them from a very young age, oftentimes from childhood, like what our friends are playing with or what kind of toys our parents give us. There was some overlap, like occasionally my brother would play with Barbies and I would play with Nerf guns, but most of the time we kind of stuck to our gender norms. Okay, so there is a difference between sex and gender. Sex is biological. So it's your biological features that distinguish males, females, and intersex peoples. Intersex is a term used to describe people with either one or both of the male-female genitalia, and so it doesn't fit neatly into one category. Versus gender, which is a learned behavior, and it's often associated with the words feminine and masculine. So when defining male, female, feminine, masculine today, the traditional definitions of feminine would be like nurturing, kind, caring, and masculine would be things like aggressiveness, assertion, competition. So we can express our gender through things like our clothing. For example, if I was dressing in a more feminine gendered way, I would wear, let's say, like earrings and jewelry. I might paint my nails, curl my hair. It can come out in our actions, so the way that we act, and then also it can come out in our language. Some of the ways that I learned these gendered behaviors was simply watching movies. I loved watching Disney movies when I was a kid, and so I learned some of these behaviors from watching my favorite Disney princesses. All right, so think back on where you learned some of your gender norms. Most of the time we learn these things from our friends and family. Our family is our first relationship, so we're going to learn these gendered behaviors from our parents. And then we're going to go to school and interact with people, and we might learn how to behave in that setting. And I put a star next to the media because the media is really influential when it comes to influencing our gendered behavior. And we call these 4 aspects agents of socialization, or ways that we become socialized in a culture. For example, if you've ever seen the show Friends, Ross shares custody of his 3-year-old son, Ben, and when Ben's mother drops him off, he's playing with a Barbie, and Ross gets really upset about this. And so he goes right over to Ben and immediately says, "Why is my boy playing with a Barbie doll?" And he swaps Barbie out for a G.I. Joe, leaving Ben's mother and her partner to sort of like roll their eyes at Ross. So in the United States, children are often aware of these gender differences by as early as the age of 2 years old. And where do we learn these gendered behaviors? Typically, we learn them from friends, family, school, media, and we call this learning from within one's culture or emic knowledge. All right, so when it comes to gender and communication, we change our language when we're speaking to men, women, boys, and girls. So girls are more likely, and twice as many likely, to hear slang or shortened words, so sort of like cutesy words. So we might say, oh, look at this little kitty, or do you want to play with your dolly, in place of kitten or doll. And fathers are more likely to reward or correct gender appropriate behavior. When I was in Target, I also saw a young boy putting on lipstick, and his father corrected him and said, son, men don't wear lipstick. So this is an example of someone correcting misgendered behavior. So, more about gendered language. Have you ever had this happen to you where you've experienced gendered language? I've had this happen many times in my life. Typical things like, oh, why aren't you smiling? You should be smiling more. Or that's not a job that a girl would have. Or even my father would say things like, don't burp. It's not ladylike. And so those are some examples of how I've experienced gendered language in my life. All right, so when it comes to gender communication and culture, women and men in different cultures speak different languages sometimes. So, for example, in Japanese, word endings for female speakers are wa, and for men it's na or na. In Thai, there are different words for men and women. So if you're greeting someone, you would say sawadee krab if you're a man, and you would say sawadee ka if you're a female. Even pronunciations have connotations in different languages that connotate masculine or feminine. For example, el in Spanish is a masculine word, or la is feminine. And gender also affects how we communicate, because when you're looking at Hofstede's scale from 0 to 100, those cultures that score higher in masculinity usually have more strict gender roles, and they usually have men who speak up more and tend to make decisions for the entire household. This isn't always the case, but in higher masculinity cultures, we're going to see more strict gender roles. All right, so finally, we're going to talk about gender expression. So when it comes to gender expression, we have a gender spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum would be male, on another end would be female, and in the middle would be non-binary or intersex. And so it's important to note that through cultures, sexuality and gender expression is really different, and it's been different throughout history and throughout time as well. So in many cultures, they may acknowledge a gender spectrum. For example, in many Native American tribes or indigenous peoples tribes, they have a term called two-spirited, which is used to describe a person who fulfills a traditional third gender. So this might be someone that has masculine and feminine energy. And the way that we view this is really culturally dependent as well. These two-spirited people were often highly regarded for having special powers. For example, having the spirits and powers of both males and females. But it is important to note, with colonization and the spread of westernization and Christianity, we have seen more homophobic tendencies and discrimination of people in the LGBTQ plus community. Okay, so that's all we have today on gender, and we're going to move into each country next.